Okay, here's my honest thoughts about the Asylum series by Matt Dymerski. For those of you who don't know, Asylum is a series broken up into 6 parts, and it's set in the same universe as the Psychosis series, another creepypasta I'll be covering in a different video. Asylum takes place, as the name suggests, in a mental hospital set in a bleak torrential downpour. Throughout the story, the narrator, implied to be a young male doctor, often reminds us, the reader, that it's heavily raining outside. I really like this detail and the way it's implemented throughout the entire series to give the story a dreary, oppressive atmosphere. I think that Dymerski hinted at the gloomy ambience just often enough to immerse the reader in the murky environment, but seldom enough that it doesn't feel like he's trying to beat you over the head with the fact that it's raining outside all the time because the story is so #deep. Each part of the series, with the exception of the last 2, covers the story told from the perspective of one of the inmates of the asylum. The stories all carry parallels to real-world psychological problems that people deal with, and are handled in a very captivating, albeit disconcerting way. Dymerski's description of certain parts of the story are spot on in their tangible grossness, and no matter how many times I've heard these stories, certain moments always make me cringe. Certain parts of the story, like when a character is describing the stringy bits of chicken and supple lettuce she found in a guy's skull, or the swirling cream in the cup of coffee of a girl who bludgeoned 3 people to death. The first installment follows the story of a girl who has an eating disorder. It's implied later in the story that she has some kind of supernatural curse that makes the human body parts appear in her food. There is a parallel drawn to real-life unhealthy body standards that's a little heavy-handed, but serves the narrative function of the story well enough. One thing I did struggle with when I listened to this story again for the sake of this video was that I'm not quite sure whether the author's point in this series is that he's saying that these psychoses are actually caused by a malevolent force that can't be seen, or is the big bad of the story simply an allegory for the pressure created by society? This concept is brought up too many times over the course of the story. Anyway, the story ends with the girl cracking a dude's skull open with a crowbar to find edible food for the first time in weeks inside of his skull. Obviously, the reader is meant to be drawn to the conclusion that the girl is crazy or has some kind of autophagic tendencies, but the conclusion gets thrown violently into question later in the series, creating a sense of doubt in the reader's preconceived notions, as well as the reliability of the narrator. In part 2, the subject is a junkie who gives a fantastical tale about an insectoid creature called the Bone Walker that torments him by slicing through his bones with razor-sharp claws. I think the general theme of this chapter is intended to be the drug use and its effect on people, and possibly homelessness as well, but I've always found this chapter to be the hardest to decipher. The other patient stories in the series all carry very clear messages as to the moral that Dymerski wishes to convey, but I find this one a little more subtle, and I kind of like it that way. I think it adds to the general mystique that the story isn't super clear from the outset. This kind of works in favor of the overall story, as the Bone Walker's victim is shown to be less than truthful later on. There's an even more unsettling parallel to rape in this chapter, as the Bone Walker literally emerges from inside the character and later stabs a leg inside the character's body, and also crawls inside of the wound he creates. It's viscerally jarring and uncomfortable to listen to, and I think that was Dymerski's intention with that scene. I honestly can't say whether I feel okay with it or not. It's a little weird, but again, I think he conveyed what he was intending to convey, and it's not really for me to dictate whether that's right or wrong. The chapter ends with the main character, the doctor, commenting that another man, a murder victim, had claimed to be assaulted by the same creature. He had said man had allegedly destroyed the creature. The doc infers at this point that the delusions can be shared and caught or infected with like a virus. An interesting thesis that the rest of the series dwells on. I like this motif, but I have to admit it's brought up a little too often and too heavy-handedly. Despite this, the concept is really well thought out and leads the series to a mostly satisfying conclusion, so I can't fault it too much. The 3rd chapter follows a college student whose parents are implied to be from an impoverished country. The big theme on this chapter is the student loan crisis, I think. On paper, this sounds like a drastic and extremely unwelcome tone shift, but it's executed significantly better than it would sound like. I really like the attention to detail given to this chapter in the descriptions of ordinary things, people, objects that the girl interacts with. I like how she describes the guy that gives her the caffeine pills like he's snivelly, drippy, writhing, full of pus. These on-point descriptions really do create a vivid mental image that sticks with you long after reading or listening to the story. Not to mention the way that the student describes her work ethic, the classes, tests, papers, etc. that she has to do. It really gives you the feeling of being dropped right down into the university with her. And it gives me that unparalleled feeling of dread that only college experiences can create. The story follows her as she falls into some sort of fraud scholarship scheme that continually asks her to do more and more work, starting with a short paper and eventually becoming a doctorate-level thesis. The build, the carrot dangling are very well placed and don't break the immersion for the reader. The part where she stabs the classmate and the security guard did pull me out of the story a little. The descriptions of the characters at this point just kind of made me think of Aliens or something. It didn't really match the tone of the build-up or the tone of the rest of the series. The story does explain later on that those descriptions were the result of the girl's facial recognition being turned off due to exhaustion. So again, it makes sense once you've read the whole story, but it's kind of a head-scratcher, at least the first time you read it. The descriptions of writhing purple blobs with fleshy extensions, so on, it just felt a little off the tone of the rest of the story for me. It's in this chapter when the main character begins to question his boss about the unusual circumstance surrounding his situation. This section is an interesting commentary on the mental health industry that left me somewhat confused. It gave me the same feeling as the mental health message in Joker. My question being, is the author saying the mental health institution is bad? Is he saying they need more funding? Is he saying we should just disband them? I had a hard time following his message, and it made this section really murky for me. That said, the interaction between the main character and his boss, the chief of medicine, feels natural and believable enough. It basically ends with the doctor deciding not to clue in the chief as to how much further he's going to take his investigation. As a random side note, I also like how the main character isn't mind-numbingly stupid in this scene by giving himself away to his boss, throwing a temper tantrum and demanding the answers, or that the chief listen to him or whatever, like so many characters in these stories tend to do. It always really got on my nerves. So I like that this character doesn't do that. The fact that the narrator picks up on how the chief isn't willing to help him makes him seem like a lot more cunning and likable as a character, even if it makes him seem a little bit too smart to feel completely natural. The fourth section went over my head for the longest time when I was a kid. For anyone who doesn't know, which I would assume is no one if you're watching this video, this chapter follows the story of a man who falls into a toxic relationship with a girl who abuses him and bullies him into giving her all of his money and buying her whatever she wants, not to mention the physical torture she inflicts on him. When I was younger, I didn't really understand the implications of a real-life codependent relationship like this, so I always struggled to understand why the victim of this story was so over the top with his stupidity and his need to be validated by the girl. Hell, he even says at one point on his account, as long as she validated me, I was on cloud 9 and it didn't matter what she did to me. As an adult with some experiences, I obviously have a much clearer lens to understand the subtler theme of this chapter. Mental abuse and toxic relationships are nothing to scoff at, and I don't think Dymerski is doing that with this story the way I thought he was when I was too young to understand the power dynamics between real-world domestic violence situations. I think Dymerski's treatment of the subject is somewhat exaggerated on purpose in order to convey how abusive relationships can look to people on the outside. What may seem absolutely crazy to a healthy person can seem completely normal to someone trapped in an abuse cycle. It's a strange phenomenon that can happen to anyone, no matter how smart they are. Unfortunately, the story kind of depicts the male abuse victim as a creeper or fool, the way he's introduced in his story, and it's very uncomfortable and weird and makes him come across as somewhat tone-deaf at the very least. The story kind of follows a real-life stereotype about how a quote-unquote nice guy is the only type of guy to be pulled into these relationships. This trope is turned on its head when the girl, Claire, attacks the doctor in the middle of his recording of the male patient's account. What I mean is Claire, first of all, is the male patient's nurse. She's also the girlfriend that he's talking about in the story. She has this bizarre flirty dynamic with the male doctor throughout the entirety of this chapter, and he comments on how flustered she made him feel in a way that wasn't usual for him. The implication is that Claire actually had some kind of unnatural power that caused men, or maybe just anyone she wanted, to fall for her charms. It's a nice diversion, and a development that saves the story from falling into a weird sort of predictability, what with the male abuse victim being a total creeper and weirdo himself. The doctor goes to the chief of medicine after the attack and threatens that he'll call the police. Eventually, the chief talks him out of it, citing that if their hospital gets shut down, the doctor will never get the answers he's looking for regarding the pattern. This part of the story bugs me because I found it hard to understand why the chief would still allow the doctor to roam scot-free through the facility, even though he's clearly aware of how much he knows. He even encourages the doctor, who he knows is close to blowing the whole scheme wide open, to take a day off and leave the facility. potentially being outside of his realm of surveillance. Considering the end reveal of this entire story, it strikes me as kind of unlikely that the chief would let him out of his sight when he's so close to uncovering the truth about everything. The 5th chapter has a couple of different threads to play out. First, the doctor goes back to demand answers from the Bonewalker victim, suddenly realizing that he left something out of his story. Maybe it's a me problem, but I never exactly understood how he figured out that this patient was different from the other ones, or how he linked the Bonewalker to the ultimate villain of this story. By the way, I guess I should explain. The story implies that the Bonewalker and the enemy of the story are some kind of mortal enemies, and that the villain is somehow able to resist or destroy the Bonewalker. Anyway, my point is the patient suddenly having a completely different story where he was the one who sought out the Bonewalker and followed his orders willingly rather than being kind of a victim of the Bonewalker. The fact that the doctor suddenly realizes this just in the wake of Claire's attack without really any further explanation, I never really understood what effect any of this had on the rest of the story anyway, so it just seems like kind of a weird plot beat to throw in there. After having his suspicions about the Bonewalker slave confirmed, the doctor visits a 5th patient at the quote-unquote dark end of the building. It said that this patient has the most dangerous mental affectation of all, and it's implied that his psychotic ideas are so virulent that he can infect anyone he discusses them with. It turns out that this patient is potentially the main character from Dymerski's preceding story, Psychosis, in which a man is isolated in a basement for several weeks before the nerve fiber infected people abduct him from his home and apparently place him here in the asylum. I like the tie-in between the two stories, but I also have a few problems with it. Earlier in this chapter, it's strongly implied that the patient is a danger to anyone who is allowed to hear his story, and that the mere listen of it will cause the listener to adopt the patient's psychosis. My problem is the narrator of the story disproves this by stating he read the story himself on the internet long before coming into contact with this patient here in the asylum. I have 2 theories about this. 1, this is in fact the basement-dwelling computer programmer from Psychosis, and for some reason the enemy is just paranoid about letting anyone hear his story for some reason, even though this male doctor already did and it didn't infect him, at least not yet. Theory 2, this male patient is someone who already read Psychosis and figured out the truth based on the man's writings. Ultimately, whichever theory is true, it doesn't really matter, as ultimately his story doesn't really affect the main character in any meaningful way anyway. Side note, I get that for the reader, this plot reveal kind of creates a connection between Psychosis and Asylum and reveals a lot for the reader, but it doesn't really do anything for the character of the doctor or the character of the web designer that becomes the patient, or really any other characters in the story. The fact that they have this conversation never really affects anyone ever again, and it never really means anything throughout the course of the rest of the story. I forgot to mention earlier that throughout this entire story there are mentions of this blind girl who always feels people's temples for nerve fibers before being willing to talk to them. There's this section where the doctor has a conversation with her and explains that she's somehow writing perfect coherent documents even though she's blind, but he never explains a single thing about what she's writing. It's maddening to me, pun intended, to hell with it, that the author didn't think that such an important detail deserved to be built upon further. So to cap off the 5th chapter, while the doctor is tying up the 5th patient's story, he has some sort of hallucination of a prison break in which some of the inmates escape and kill a guard. During this episode, the doctor helps the eating disordered girl from the 1st chapter to escape before being pulled back into quote-unquote reality by the chief. It's implied later on that the breakout is actually happening, but the enemy made everyone infected with the nerve fibers see that everything was normal. It never becomes completely clear. There's sort of this dual reality thing. Dymerski never really chooses which reality is actually real. But after the chief snaps the doc out of it, the emaciated girl disappears from all the records and the memories of the staff. It's worth noting that the patients still remember her, as well as the main character, implying that he's now one of them, either crazy or one of the few that aren't controlled by the nerve fibers. I feel like the whole nerve fiber thing is Dymerski's allegory for societal pressures or something, but I digress. The final chapter completes the journey of the doctor into freedom or madness, depending on which angle you believe. Basically, he starts having this crazy migraine and seeking out the blind girl again. She says a few cryptic things and then implies that he shouldn't be able to ask her questions that he's asking her, further cementing that he's either losing the delusion or going crazy. When he feels his head, he realizes he can both feel smooth temples and nerve fibers in his temples, like some sort of double reality, which I think is actually a really cool part of the story. She says something to the effect of what you see isn't real because of the nerve fibers. At that, he just kind of leaves the room randomly and goes to the OR that the asylum has for some reason. By the way, I'm pretty sure the story states that this is an asylum and not a hospital with other wings. So I don't know, maybe asylums usually have ORs and I'm just overthinking this. Anyway, this kind of leads to one of the most painful, cringe-inducing scenes I've ever read in a creepypasta. The doc removes his eyes one at a time and fishes out all the foreign nerve fibers that the blind girl said were controlling him. I gotta give credit to Dymerski here, as it's truly unsettling to read the way his eyes dangle out of his head, the realistic feelings that the writer communicates. It's unbelievably uncomfortable to listen to in a super effective way. After he removes nerve fibers from his eye sockets, he realizes that he doesn't have a headache anymore. And by the way, he does put his eyes back in, so the story says anyway. And he's only seeing one version of everything. The blinders have been lifted, so to speak. He's not having that double reality sensation anymore now that the nerve fibers have been pulled out of his head. Then comes this whole epiphany scene where he puts all the pieces together and sort of just figures out what the enemy is, and that it's some sort of ethereal greater intelligence that's everywhere and controlling everyone. That the reason the mentally ill people weren't infected was because their ideas were somehow dangerous to it, as if they could somehow destroy it with their own mental illnesses. The story kind of falls apart for me here for two reasons. First, certain parts of the story strongly imply that the patient's stories are true. The emaciated girl is able to get a bone out of a candy bar the doctor gives her from the vending machine during the prison break sequence. It's stated that the police find victims of the bone walker that sort of confirm it was a real monster and not just some fabrication. And Claire does end up having some sort of supernatural powers over people, or at least the narrator of this story implies that she does. All of these factors make it confusing as to why the enemy can't afford to regard them. If the stories are all true, then doesn't that by definition mean that the patients aren't crazy and that they're not dangerous to the enemy? My second problem with the scene is, if the stories aren't true, does that mean that the enemy is also not real? Is it just a fabrication of the narrator's mind? Is the doctor himself crazy? Is there some kind of group delusion in all the patients' minds, as hinted at in Psychosis? The psychologist basically implies that the nerve fibers are like this belief that all the insane people have created, and it's like this shared paranoia thing. But in Psychosis, it's also pretty firmly confirmed that the nerve fibers are real at the end of the story, so I'm not quite sure what Dymerski is trying to say with Asylum. It feels like there's certain parts of the story that feels like he's like retroactively making Psychosis more of a question mark, where Psychosis ends on more of a certainty, like he's not crazy, the world is actually taken over by the nerve fibers and everyone knows it, but for some reason the programmer guy from that story is like the only one that isn't infected. But in this story, it's kind of more unclear. It kind of seems like the story isn't sure whether it wants to be this dystopian thing where the nerve fibers are real, or if it wants to be like this mindfuck where the main character is crazy. Anyway, putting aside the wave of paranoia and the stroke that Dymerski's given me, after the eye extraction scene, the chief comically walks in on the doctors and loudly booms, "What the hell have you done to yourself?" It's just so hammy and overdone that I can't not love it in a way. The timing totally gives me cartoon vibes, like when the main character does something wrong and suddenly all the other characters are there wagging their fingers in shame. Long story short, the doctor escapes the asylum by recreating the hallucination he had of the emaciated girl escaping. He realizes after he leaves that everyone infected with the fibers is basically possessed, for lack of a better word. He vows to free the world of these fibers, one pair of eyes at a time. So final thoughts on the story as a whole. Like I said, certain parts of the plot don't quite fit well together coherently, and it's left me wondering whether the story is actually about some fiendish plot by a scary nerve fiber monster, or if this entire story is the fabrication of the doctor's delusional mind. I mean, his rant at the end about how he brought his scalpel out of the hospital and today is the day of our revolution is a little frightening and unnerving and makes him sound kind of crazy, to say the least. It's super unclear as to whether the enemy is real or just some weird like euphemism for societal pressures. There's a lot of really heavy-handed commentary about how the enemy feeds on caffeine and consumption and capitalism and consumerism and like all these really weird like American concepts, and it feels like this American society is bad and we're all in such a rush and everyone is like going crazy because of it. And the point is, I struggle to understand if the story is about that or if it's about like the dystopian nerve fibers taking over everything and killing everyone. I'm not quite sure what the message is. Is he trying to say that crazy people are actually the sane ones and everyone who lives a normal life is actually being ruled by some sort of unseen force? Is he trying to blame mental illness on societal pressure, like I said earlier? Is he saying that the mental health care system is bad? I guess it's open to interpretation, or maybe everything in the story is supposed to be taken literally and I'm overthinking this. All in all, script writing this video has made me doubt myself and my conclusions and the story way more than I did before writing. I really like the story in some ways a little more and in some ways a little less now that I've written an entire video about it. So in the end, I'd have to say it's a good story, very heavy on the unsettling vibes, a little heavy-handed at times on its commentary, but I'd give it 8 out of 10 skeletons. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.